What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I'm pleased to have with me a special guest, Shahid Buttar, who is a candidate for Congress. He's running against Nancy Pelosi in the 12th Congressional District, but obviously Pelosi has a lot more significance beyond that district. And I had the pleasure of spending some time with Shahid in Cuba. We both were on a trip with Code Pink in the spring of 2015. And I've been following his career ever since. He was with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he specializes in privacy issues. Is that not correct?
Essentially, I would call it dissent protection more than privacy, but yes, absolutely. And that trip to Cuba was an incredible highlight of the last decade for me, and I was grateful to share that time together.
Yes. So anyway, we're going to be getting into Shahid's background and his platform in his campaign against Pelosi. But first, we want to talk about something that's very newsworthy because this is his area of expertise. And just today, Apple and Google announced that they would be joining forces to make contact tracing more convenient and ubiquitous by enabling 3 billion people with their smartphones to receive alerts if they cross paths with an infected person. Also, in researching this show, I've realized that France and Bolivia have postponed their elections using the coronavirus as an excuse. Israel is getting cell phone data to make sure that quarantined people stay home and to see who they are in contact with. Hungary closed down opposition media and overhauled their constitution to ensure that their fascist leader remains in power. Belgium authorities requisitioned cell phone tracking data to make sure people don't go too far from home. Moscow police busted quarantine violators with facial recognition-enabled cameras. NSA contractor Palantir is helping the British National Health Authority track infections. In Mexico, Uber sent rider data to trace the route of an infected tourist and banned 240 users who took rides with that driver from using Uber.
Okay.
And a company called Dragonfly announced COVID-19 sensing drones that can detect coughing and sneezing, fevers, heart and respiratory rates to be used in Australia. Now, I just find this mind-boggling. You did a Twitter thread on what Trump and Republican legislators are trying to do in our country because of the coronavirus. Can you expand on that thread?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for summarizing that wave around the world of right-wing authoritarian power grabs. And I've occasionally recently had the opportunity to cite Naomi Klein, who has this very prescient analysis in the shock doctrine of the way that social crises have been weaponized by the right wing, particularly with respect to privatizing social services and a range of other issues. What we are living through now is an equivalent with respect to potentially authoritarian powers. And surveillance is one of them, detention is another. Let's talk a little bit about the ways in which the Trump administration has tried to take advantage of this crisis. One of them is by seeking the extension of provisions of the Patriot Act that have thankfully expired as they were scheduled to do so. on no fewer than half a dozen occasions, corporate Democrats led by Nancy Pelosi have joined with the authoritarian wing of the Republican Party to seek the extension of those powers, which, just to remind your viewers, were adopted in the effective dead of night, off the shelf. This was a proposal that predated the national security crisis that they were passed in response to. And the bill was so long that most members of Congress never read it. And there's never been a debate about it in the better part of 20 years. And Nancy Pelosi is one of the architects of the surveillance state. And having fought it from Washington to San Francisco and at the local level and dozens of cities between, I'm very eager to draw a contrast there. Now, Nancy Pelosi in December whipped votes, and Congress did extend the Patriot Act that recently. Thankfully, they only did so for 3 months, and the expiring provisions, namely Section 215, that's sometimes described as the business records provision. It was also known at different points as the library records provision. It has expired, again, as it was scheduled to. One hole in the bucket I want to point out here, Senator Burr, the very same Republican senator from North Carolina who was recently implicated in insider trading, he said just a few months ago that even if the provisions of the Patriot Act expired as they were scheduled to expire, that they wouldn't require the executive branch to make any changes because Trump has an inherent executive authority under an Executive Order 12333 announced by the Reagan administration many years before, that to continue all of the same warrantless surveillance activity. And it's one thing to recognize the need for data collection in the face of a pandemic. And I want to sharply distinguish that, which can be subject to transparency. It can be subject to oversight. That kind of a program, a public health regarding surveillance program, could have very tight use limits so that the data that's collected in that context isn't then shared with, say, police departments or credit agencies or national security agencies. There could also be collection limits so that people are only subjected to those measures if, for instance, they opt in. One way you might opt into some of those measures is by, in the context of a shelter order, being in public. There could also be other ways to better respect individual choice so that, for instance, with Apple or Google, you have to have one of their phones to effectively opt into this program. I'd like to see users have an affirmative opt-in to participate in this program.
Yeah, it says that they will have to opt in and that location data will not be collected.
And that matters. That's a good example of the kind of parameter that can better respect user privacy and dissent at a time when we might concede the need for there to be some measure of government data collection. And if there is an opt-in right and the location is not tracked more generally, and there are tight limits to make sure that this data isn't then used, for instance, to market ads to people or used to discriminate according to what people might think or who they associate with. Those are the real concerns that I would have. It's not, I wouldn't say that we have to end surveillance in the abstract. I say that if we're going to surveil anybody, there has to be transparency and accountability. We have to make sure that we're not allowing those measures in secret to become holes in the bucket of our democracy. And the pandemic threatens that very same dynamic, which we have seen in the relatively recent past. The Patriot Act is a perfect example. So the history of CIA torture provides another one. We have a habit in the United States of giving lip service to principles that we fail to defend when it matters. And the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, for that matter, the Fifth and the 14th, all of these constitutional principles are implicated here. And as is even more baseline commitments like simple responsiveness of our government to popular concerns, or responsiveness to whistleblowers when they come forward with facts that should inform Congress. And when Congress vilifies government whistleblowers as spies, and that's what's happened over the last more than a decade. That practice became in favor under the Obama administration, unfortunately. And we have to welcome whistleblowers and invite the facts that they have to share with us, even when it contradicts official narratives. And this, just to press on this, and I'll try to, stop this diatribe after that, to the point that you raise, what's happening in Washington, there is a conflation between the powers of national security officials and so-called national security. National security does not inhere in blindly giving powers to three-letter agencies that are unaccountable to we the people. National security inheres particularly in making sure that our democracy survives the pandemic, national security, the biggest national security imperative at the moment is keeping the post office open. And I'd love to frame that in terms of national security. Just the last thing I'd say on the power grab is detention. In addition to surveillance powers, the Trump administration, through the Attorney General Barr, has also written a letter to Congress seeking the authority for chief judges to suspend and disregard habeas corpus. This is incredibly dangerous. It could be the nail in a coffin of democracy. The right to trial, due process, the presumption of innocence, these are quintessentially American ideals that we, especially under this president, dare not let slip through our fingers. It's one thing to tinker with core bedrock protections under an administration in which we might have some confidence of respect for anything. I don't know, reason, the rule of law, human rights, what have you. This administration knows none of those limits.
Well, I will say that I think these powers get concentrated with the executive no matter which administration it is. I mean, look at Obama. I was a member of Occupy. I don't know if you were,
Yeah.
but I remember protesting the NDAA, I forget which year it was,
2012.
where they were going to be criminalizing protest. In fact, they called it the Occupy law. And they made it so that if you were, I remember the language, it was knowingly and willingly in a Secret Service protection zone, you could be jailed for up to a year and $1,000 and 10 years and $10,000, I think, if you had a weapon. Don't quote me on that. Maybe you know if that's exactly right, but
the part of the NDAA that I was focused on were the military detention provisions. And in late 2011, there was a proposal while we were occupying cities around the country. And I was astounded. I was in Washington working as a civil liberties advocate. I was running the Bill of Rights Defense Committee at the time. And plenty of journalists and plenty of policy wonks on the Hill said, this bill can't be used to detain people. And of course, the textual language permits that space. And frankly, I don't like to speak about it too much because I don't want to give this criminal president any bright ideas. But there's been a lingering sword of Damocles hovering over our democracy for the last 10 years. And all that is to say, these detention powers that Trump's attorney general is seeking, I don't want to say that they're duplicative. It's just to say that we have to guard the right to trial and due process. It's very dangerous if we let the government start locking people up and throwing away the key without having to answer to an independent authority to prove the legitimacy of that detention. And that's true whether we're talking about criminal justice or whether we're talking about public health. We can't just give blanket detention authorities to government officials to use those authorities unaccountably. That will predictably undermine the rights of not just individuals, but entire communities. And if it starts becoming a way for the right wing to use a hammer against its political opponents, it will cost us our democracy.
Well, let me tell you a concern that I have about this, because I remember protesting on Hollywood Boulevard about this, and we couldn't get any of the passersby to stop and even take a flyer. As soon as we explained to them what it was about, they didn't care because they never foresee themselves as protesting anything. So I feel like these privacy issues, these surveillance issues, don't seem to bother people as much as, say, the economic issues that we're concerned with, like healthcare and housing and good wages, childcare, what have you. Because people, I think, are just kind of willing to let some of their rights go, especially with privacy. Young people just assume that, you know, these companies are tracking what we're doing on social media so that they can sell products to us, and they don't seem to care about it. Have you noticed this trend yourself among the general public, or do you think this is just something that concerns activists like ourselves?
Great question. I think there's absolutely generational shifts in terms of how people both use technology and how they relate to the government and our own history. One of the things, I have an opportunity often to speak at colleges and law schools, and one of the things that I found really alarming over the last 10 years, I will speak even to audiences that include people who lived through it, and I will ask, to whom in this audience does the amalgam COINTELPRO mean anything? And even in audiences that include people who lived through it, no one remembers that era. And for people who might not remember, there was a 50-year saga in the United States of the FBI infiltrating specifically in order to neutralize First Amendment protected domestic groups. And that era of the vicious suppression of dissent notwithstanding our textual commitment under the First Amendment to allow speech and allow organizing and allow assembly and allow the petition for redress of grievances, in spite of those commitments, in not one instance, or even a dozen, but dozens, including Puerto Rican independence activists, including environmentalists, including peace activists, including civil rights activists across the country, the FBI was engaged basically in a domestic speech suppression racket. And Congress investigated in the 70s, discovered this to be true, and tried to put an end to it. Frankly, as an advocate and an expert in this arena, I know how poorly that attempt worked. And I understand that the FBI's assault on free speech continued well beyond that. I spent several years earlier in my career, from 2008 to 2010 in particular, focused specifically on the FBI's suppression of peace activists, animal rights activists, and religious minorities. And that was a problem at the time that we never fixed. And, you know, it's only continued to be a problem since. And the FBI's assault on free speech is not a new phenomenon. It goes back 100 years. One of the Bureau's very first projects was the Palmer raids, and that was rounding up labor union activists in the 1910s to suppress left-wing organizing at the time. And so we have to look at these measures informed by that history, which I've been disappointed that more Americans don't recognize. To your point about how people often focus on economic needs, I would describe it as folks focusing on whatever is in front of them. And making rent when the economy shut down is really difficult. And so people are appropriately concerned with securing a rent and a mortgage freeze and forgiveness. And I'm happy to talk about that and why that needs to be a priority in the next coronavirus stimulus package. But just to finish this point, as an immigrant, civil liberties issues are not lost on me. I know too well what happens when we lose them. My family fled a country that has, for 50 years, struggled to maintain a democracy in the face of repeated military coups supported by the Pentagon. And so I understand how fragile democracy can be. I wouldn't be in the United States as a human being. I wouldn't have lived here if democracies were not as fragile as they are. I appreciate and I so value deeply the phenomenon of democracy here. I'm running ultimately to defend democracy in America at a time when it is threatened. And I think a lot of Americans, for better or worse, you know, recognize the threat to their families economically. They don't necessarily recognize that we are all frogs being boiled in water that is growing increasingly hot.
Well, I'll tell you, I ran up against this, of course, with Occupy. As you know, it was the Department of Homeland Security that had a conference call with 28 Democratic mayors. And after that conference call, all those Occupy encampments were cleared with the very same excuses, that there was rapes, there was crimes, there was homelessness, there was public health hazards. And I continued to do protesting even after Occupy and kept running up against, you know, the Secret Service protection zone. I was the point person in LA for all the actions against the TPP and for net neutrality. So I protested Obama fundraisers because I knew that while the mainstream media would have no interest in covering wonkish issues like the TPP and net neutrality, they always came out to cover when Obama came to town. So I have photos of me running up against these Secret Service protection zones that extended a quarter of a mile from where the president was going to be. And I got right in their faces. And I said, you are infringing on my right for a petition to redress grievances to my government. I can't stand here a quarter of a mile away and expect that Obama's going to hear me. And I did this every time. I challenged the LAPD. I demanded to see the Secret Service. I mean, I have a video, I'm probably going to post in this when I edit it, of me, you know, the one TPP thing, I realized, ooh, there was a back entrance to this place in Bel Air. I'm going to go around this back entrance.
Okay.
At this point, it was just me, and I just had my sign, and I faced down this line of police. Now, the next thing that happened to me was, you know, you talk about prosecuting whistleblowers and journalists, and we know that Obama prosecuted more whistleblowers and journalists under the Espionage Act than all presidents in the 100 years that was combined.
Yeah, 250-year proceeding history, but yes, absolutely, yes.
And So I was up at the Poor People's Campaign covering that in Sacramento 2 summers ago, and they targeted me first. They didn't go after the activist across the galley who were, you know, singing and chanting and dropping banners. They
Yeah.
went after me, who was holding my phone silently. And I was really trying to find an attorney up there. Tried to speak to this Mark Maron, who is supposedly this big civil liberties attorney, to take my case because I wanted to sue them for false arrest. I wasn't planning on getting arrested, but when they told me that I had to clear the gallery, they said, we're going to give you one more warning and then we're going to arrest you. And I said, fine, I'll live stream my arrest. And the next thing you know, you see the camera drop to the floor because by this point I've got my hands behind my back.
Uh-huh.
But they ultimately, and I was in there with like 42 other people, and there were pastors.
Let's applaud you for your citizen journalism, because that is exactly the sensibility we need. We need citizens to hold our government accountable, and that's
Well,
really.
you know
Please go on. That's really impressive.
I was just chatting with Adaya Schlossberg. I mean, she was covering the protests at Standing Rock, and she was charged with 40 years and all these horrific federal crimes. Same thing with Amy Goodman. They dropped the charges, but you know, it's outrageous. And now let's talk about, I want to ask you about Julian Assange.
But before you go there, can I just riff on the arrest for journalism angle? Because you were raising getting arrested for journalism. I'd love just to share a story there if I may. Again, I want to applaud all of the independent journalists who are shining a light on these important issues, especially the people who will get on the street and, like you're doing, get in positions where unfortunately dissent is being suppressed. I had an opportunity, I know we have some mutual friends at Code Pink who alerted me. This was not long, I think maybe just before, or maybe just after we were in Cuba together, but that spring in 2015, I came to a hearing chaired by, at the time, he was still with us, Senator John McCain, was the chair of the Armed Services Committee, and testifying before his committee, I believe it was February 2015, was James Clapper. James Clapper was the director of national intelligence under the Obama administration, and I asked him a question after the hearing was gavelled to a close. So I was not protesting anything. I didn't interrupt him. I respected the process, and I tried to ask him a question because I was writing an article for Truth Out, particularly about the failures of executive accountability. And I asked James Clapper, how do you justify never facing a charge for perjury when lying to the Senate under oath about mass surveillance, when at the time, a few months before, Eric Garner was just killed in the street by NYPD without a charge and without a trial for selling cigarettes without a license. And the result of me asking that question was me being marched out of the hearing room in handcuffs, and Clapper walking out the other room with his pension and his entourage. And now he's on MSNBC every night, just like John Brennan. And it's amazing to me that we do effectively give the microphone and legitimacy to people who literally can't travel internationally for fear of being rightfully detained by foreign governments that retain the same commitments to international human rights that we once fought a world war to establish. And I am frankly outraged that we would be willing to sacrifice such important principles simply because some people have wrapped themselves in an American flag while violating them. We have to vindicate those principles, including human rights, especially when it's our people violating those principles. And I'll just leave it then. Then a threat to dissent is really important, and I'm eager to defend First Amendment principles in office.
Well, what's really sad is that the mainstream corporate media doesn't really do their job in terms of speaking truth to power. They are essentially stenographers for the corporate state, I like to say, because they have these spooks like Malcolm Nance, and you mentioned James Clapper and others, as paid employees, paid pundits, basically promoting Russiagate and all these, conspiracy theories. Now, I did a show on Russia disinformation campaign, and yeah, they bought $100,000 worth of Facebook ads. But the way our government blew it up and the way the corporate media amplified that overreaction to it was extremely detrimental, not only for our democracy, but for our foreign policy, because now we're in a new Cold War with a country that we need to be getting along with, and we need to be denuclearizing, and instead we're ramping up. I had Daniel Ellsberg on my show, and we discussed this. And we also discussed Julian Assange, who I want to ask you about,
yes,
because just yesterday I saw that his partner revealed herself. This is a woman who is an attorney of his, who started a relationship with him when he was in prison in Ecuador, I should say in the embassy in Ecuador. And she bore 2 children of his. And she was on Twitter last night making an announcement, basically saying that she fears for his life because he is stuck in that Belmarsh prison in London, which is a hotbed, like so many of our prisons here. I did a show on that last week. I covered a car protest because people can't protest now. That's another concern. I covered a car protest today. But the one I covered last week was to release the prisoners and the detainees in the immigrant detention centers, because it's a powder keg where they're kept in crowded, unsanitary conditions. And the one I covered today was the nurses at UCLA Santa Monica Hospital that don't have enough PPE. So what do you think about the fact not only that Julian Assange is being charged in the way that he's being charged as a traitor, and not the whistleblower that he is, but also the fact that the media isn't coming to his defense and isn't reporting on any of this?
Unfortunately, the corporate media's willingness to stand in solidarity with its own interests is decidedly lacking. And it's important to think about the roles of whistleblowers with respect to the project and profession of journalism. Journalists who remain committed to their own profession recognize whistleblowers as fact bearers, right? And when you before described a lot of corporate media sources as unfortunately, succumbing to stenography, and I agree with that. One dimension in which this becomes true is the adoption of official narratives, particularly when responding to the revelations that whistleblowers bring forth. You mentioned Daniel Ellsberg, and I'm so glad that you're shining a light on his voice, which is so incredibly historically important in our country. He's a perfect example of a whistleblower who our system was forced to heed, particularly by members of Congress who stood up for the facts. I'm thinking particularly of Senator Mike Gravel, who stood up for and read the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record. And when the Nixon administration tried to shut it down, members of Congress had the independence and the spine to stand up, exactly what members of Congress today are not doing in the face of the Trump administration. And we need to have members of Congress who recognize the need to embrace whistleblowers, to defend them, to bring their facts forward, particularly when it challenges official narratives. Edward Snowden comes to mind. Julian Assange comes to mind. Edward Snowden is in international exile. Julian Assange is imprisoned in a place where he's going to be at risk.
Chelsea Manning just finally got released. She would have stayed in there forever if she was forced to do what they wanted her to do. She was taking one for the team.
That's right. Reality Winner comes to mind as well. And even the ones who don't get jailed and effectively tortured, I'm thinking now of say Thomas Drake or William Binney, who was raided at 5 a.m. in his house while he's taking a shower, if I recall correctly. Yeah. These examples, and these aren't people who are activists. They aren't people they're certainly not spies, but we treat them that way. These are people who checked all the right boxes. They went to work for the government, and what drove them to bring forth facts was not an agenda to challenge some official. It wasn't to promote some political perspective. It certainly was not to undermine the national security of the United States. Every one of them confronted corruption, lies by officials that the public needed to know about. And when we shoot the messengers, we do ourselves a disservice. And I think that's a transpartisan value. You don't have to be a democratic socialist to believe that when government employees come forth and say that the career appointed officials are lying to you, that the rest of us should listen instead of throwing them in prison and driving them into international exile. I saw Nancy Pelosi vilify Edward Snowden, and I don't think we've had a truer American patriot in a century. And I'm very inspired by his sacrifices. And he very explicitly connects his acts to the legacy of Daniel Ellsberg. And Snowden is Ellsberg. And the difference between Ellsberg and Snowden is that we had a Mike Gravel in Congress when Daniel Ellsberg came forward. I'm running for Congress because the next Edward Snowden needs to know that someone in that body will stand up for them, will stand up for we the people of the United States, and will stand up for the Constitution. Unfortunately, Congress is lacking, particularly in Nancy Pelosi's district, in precisely that dimension.
Yeah, well, I want to get into your platform and also your campaign and how it's doing, but I just have one more question about this topic that we're talking about, and that is what the government can do under the guise of security for a pandemic.
Mm.
Now, you saw the Democratic Party cravenly not try to stop the primaries or turn them into vote by mail. Joe Biden was telling people to go out and vote. You know, Bernie Sanders was telling them to get absentee ballots. But in the case of Wisconsin, and I had somebody report remotely from a polling place in Wisconsin, and interviewed people online, many of whom were not wearing masks, but they were just there because they felt it was important to vote, you know. That was a case of the right-wing Republican Senate leader not canceling that. The Democratic governor did want to cancel it. The Wisconsin Democratic Party, and I think I'm going to have Ben Wickler on my show, who's the chair of that.
Get the courts. The courts played an unfortunate role.
Yes, that's what I want to get to, because we're talking about all the institutions being sold out. You know, Chris Hedges, I mentioned this on my show last night about Dem enter, Dem exit. I am, you know, and I want to ask you about electoral politics. I'm so done with electoral politics. I feel like all of our institutions are sold out. Our Congress, our courts, our journalists, our clergy, our academic institutions are bought out now. I really feel like Chris Hedges is right that the only solution is mass nonviolent civil disobedience. But what happens, before we talk about that, what happens if Trump tries to cancel the general election? I mean, people are actually worried that he is going to be like this fascist that's going to try to use the coronavirus. Maybe he'll let people go out too soon now, reopen the country, and then there's going to be a new epidemic, and so he's going to be forced to close it down again just before the election. What do you think about that?
It's a real risk. It's why I describe keeping the post office open and in public hands as the top national security imperative confronting the United States. And the national security of the United States does not adhere simply in protecting against foreign invasions. It's about preserving our republic. And the biggest threat to our republic is I don't want to describe it as a remote danger. I will describe it as a likely possibility of a criminal tyrant attempting to railroad our democracy. Now, the hole in that bucket, of course, is that corporate Democrats have nominated someone who I don't think Trump has to fear politically, because Biden has no support, seemingly doesn't have any volunteers, you know, can't speak in public without a teleprompter. You know, I'm gravely concerned with the electoral landscape for the 2020 election. And I would hope that the president, given that he has such a strong hand to play against a weak candidate, will at least respect the process enough to let the election proceed. Vote by mail is imperative. We can't lose the post office. If we lose the post office and the pandemic persists and people can't vote without putting themselves at risk, we are ducking into the punch of a soft coup. And people might think that's incendiary. Again, my family has lived through these things, and I would just invite us to look abroad. This is a dangerous time to take for granted principles that hang by a thread. And elections and their legitimacy is one of them. Another one that you touched on just now is the co-optation of our courts. People, I think, don't entirely recognize that the federal judiciary has been successfully weaponized by the right wing. I fought Brett Kavanaugh's nomination in 2006 to the DC circuit. A lot of people became aware of his name in the last few years. I have watched for 2 decades, and it started 2 decades before that, frankly, even 2.5. In the 1970s is when the right wing started organizing to take over the federal courts, and they have been entirely successful. So much so that Trump, particularly because Harry Reid gave away the nuclear option in the last session of Congress, Trump has railroaded dozens of judicial nominees through the Senate. He has appointed at this point something like 25 to 30% of the federal bench, including multiple justices of the Supreme Court. And I have a plan here. The way that we recover judicial independence at a time when the courts are politicized is to end judicial life tenure. Judicial life tenure is conceptualized as a way to protect judges from politicization, to make sure that they don't have to think about what's happening in the body politic outside the courtroom. But when the justices are put on the bench, precisely to promote a political agenda, and that agenda is hidden from the American people in their confirmation hearings, when the justices are criminals themselves, in the case, for instance, of Justice Kavanaugh, we need to have a check on the court to recover its independence. And the only way to do that is to cycle justices off. 18-year staggered terms would do that in a way that doesn't compromise the independence of the body, of the way that like packing the court would, for instance. So there are thoughtful constitutional responses to these measures. Again, it's why I'm running for Congress. You're not going to hear a proposal like that from Nancy Pelosi. Precisely.
That can happen through legislation.
That's exactly right. That does not require a constitutional amendment. That could be a simple act of Congress.
Yeah.